Boundary Country it's a collection of 12 short stories, half of which, 6 of them, are set in the West Kootenays, and the other half range over kind of space and time. Some are set in Toronto in the 30s and 40s, and then there's a Civil War story, and it's really quite a range of a story in Vancouver in contemporary times, and the West Kootenay stories are again, some are set in the Boundary Country, and some around here in Nelson. I worked on the book for many years because a lot of my publications since 1973 have either been poetry or essays, but I knew I always wanted to try fiction, and because people always say my poetry is very prosaic, I thought, no problem, I'll be great at fiction. But the trouble is, they say fiction's not very poetic, and so it's been a challenge. So these stories are quite worked on, and living in the West Kootenays, it's a very rich area for characters and for short story writers. So the story I'm going to read from the first section of the book considers the borders that result from the devastating loss of a love if the loser in the situation is determined to keep a friendship with the one who broke his heart. The story is called The Ring, and it relates how the central character of the story, Robert, is still obsessively in love with a former girlfriend, Jeanette. Jeanette and her husband, Colin, whom she marries rather than Robert, and the couple's young son visit Robert from Vancouver every summer. They have a friendship. And in the story, the point we're at, the group have gone off swimming on a river sandbar several kilometers from Robert's acreage. Colin, though, at one point discovers he's lost his wedding ring in the river. His wife, who's playing with their 3-year-old William on the sandbar, declares that Colin absolutely must find it, since the wedding rings, were her grandparents. Colin tries to convince Jeanette that her demand is impossible, unreasonable, given the river's strong current. A standoff between the couple on this issue makes Robert nervous, and he urges Colin to join him in at least trying to find the ring. The water swept around Robert's shins and then knees. He obediently peered down through the rippled surface at the stones and pebbles that carpeted the river bottom. While he looked, an unfamiliar sensation enveloped him. The world around him thickened unnaturally. A mental calm suffused him, a trance in which he heard a voice. "You might find this ring." Robert was startled, but he was also aware of an aura of matter-of-factness that accompanied the revelation. "You might not," the measured, self-assured voice allowed, "but you might." He was thigh-deep in the river now. He heard Colin behind him begin to pace upstream, swinging his legs in short, sideways arcs through water made viscous by its swift passage. "This is ridiculous," Colin muttered as he overtook Robert and splashed by. Talk about a needle in a haystack. "Let's just give it a shot," Robert offered. He kept his eyes scanning back and forth across the muted hues of the stony jumble underfoot. A couple of times he lifted his head to calculate how far offshore he and Colin had floated earlier. "This is pointless," he heard Colin shout from a distance. Then, as Robert told his counselor, Kostiak, at the regular session the next week, the strange state of mind he was experiencing became audible. A loud buzz reverberated through his head and increased in volume. Robert glimpsed the gold band of a ring angled on the river bottom, propped against a mottled rose and black stone. Surprised to experience no shock at the discovery, he bent to retrieve the metal, his chin just touching the water. He lifted the ring out with his right hand and held it above his head, arm dripping. "I've got it," he called over the noise in his mind. "What?" Colin hadn't heard him. "I found the ring," Robert shouted. To his amazement, his voice was steady. "Jeanette!" Colin yelled, waving his arms in her direction as he waded downstream toward Robert. The urgent tone of his cry caused her to lift her head from where it was bent over William's. When the men had initiated their search of the river, she had turned her back on them and knelt to resume playing with her son. "Robert found the ring. He found it," Colin shouted. "Robert found it?" Jeanette's voice sounded incredulous. Robert continued to hold the ring up. "He found it?" Colin stepped on shore. "You were right," he called. "Robert's got it." Jeanette was on her feet now, walking toward where Colin stood, shedding water on the sandbar. In the midst of the stream, Robert started to move to dry ground, angling toward Colin. "Do you comprehend what this means?" Kostiak blurted excitedly as Robert related the events to him. Robert had never seen Kostiak so animated. Not really, no." "You are aware what a river, being in a river, represents in Jungian terms?" Kostiak demanded. "Time?" Robert faltered. "The passage of time?" So the story goes on. When I first began to write fiction, it was a learning experience. I wasn't sure if I could do it or where the stories would go. I didn't know what my voice was in the sense of, am I going to be lean and mean, or am I going to be wordy and talkative? And working as a teacher, of course, I ended up being very talkative. And the stories aren't lean the way one of the fashions in fiction is now. The one I'm going to read a little excerpt from, and then that'll be it, is called The Dean of the Distillery. And it begins in the 1930s in Belarusia, which was then part of the Soviet Union, when the narrator is 5. His life as the son of the manager of a distillery is idyllic. His nickname among the employees and family, due to his spectacles and his childishly confident manner, is the Dean. There are shadows, though. Such matters as who ruled in Moscow seemed infinitely remote from Khobesk. Khobesk is a little village where the distillery is. In any case, this information, like the household worries that at intervals preoccupied my mother, was beyond my comprehension or concern. They wafted past as did clouds, which briefly darkened a spring morning. I was conscious of less vague threats to my round of days, but I had no reason to believe my father was not protection against any trouble. My parents, my relatives who lived nearby, and my father and his friends sometimes mumbled in low voices about attacks on Jews in Jewish homes and businesses over in Bialystok or in some settlements between ours and Minsk or away south near Lvov. Things were also very bad with Jews in some country called Germany. Once I was in town with Vlad on the wagon, a man walking by where we were halted waiting to unload yelled angrily at us. Vlad shouted back, and the man shook his fist and spat on the street. I asked Vlad what the man had said. "He thinks you should not have so much money," Vlad explained. I thought of my tin box at home where I kept my Hanukkah gelt and other coins my uncles and aunts had given me. "I've saved 26 kopecks in a tin box I got from my Zadie," I informed Vlad, puzzled. "Does that man think I have too many?" Vlad's laugh boomed out, nearly as loud as his brother's. No, he means your father has too much money. I'm sure he doesn't care about your kopecks." "Does my father have a lot of money?" Vlad spat over the side of the wagon. "Forget the man. He is an idiot." 3 times, a dozen or so men from Khobesk appeared at the yard shouting. They weaved about and bumped into each other, but their red faces were fierce when they yelled. After the first time one fall afternoon, I asked Mikhail Alexandrovich what they had wanted. "They were saying, 'Give us vodka, Jews,'" Mikhail Alexandrovich explained, "except they use another word for Jews, not a good one." We live our lives, we're sort of inside our own skin, and we're constantly bumping up against other people's boundaries, and that was a lot of the interaction. And then there's social boundaries. What's permissible, what's not permissible. And again, we constantly bump up against that. In a way, boundaries of time, how things change over time, things that we assume about the world changes over time, and then our assumptions don't hold true anymore. So that I became quite fascinated by how the stories, if you wanted to have an overriding sense of them, it was that they deal with those those boundaries. Boundaries we often don't know we've crossed until we're well on the other side in a new country. And then we realize, holy smoke, this is really different. And so that's what I wanted to explore. A lot of the stories are relationship stories, and so as everyone knows, lots of boundaries in relationships that it's quite easy to cross without knowing. And then you discover that you're in a new country.